Hello everyone, this is Russell Holden with RenderPlus Systems. I'd like to spend some time today discussing reflections with RenderPlus software. Our products are offered under several different labels. Aerial Vision, which is an extension for SketchUp. We have two other SketchUp extensions, iRenderNext and 3D Design Studio. And we have several applications sold under the NXT Render label. These are plugins for AutoCAD, Revit, and BricsCAD. Our topic today is reflections. We're going to talk about the benefit of adding reflections to renderings of 3D models. And although I will be using iRenderNext, the SketchUp extension, as an example, reflections are added to models and managed in models using the same techniques in all of these software applications. And so it doesn't really matter if you're using Aerial Vision, iRenderNext, 3D Design Studio, or any of the NXT Render applications. You'll find that the reflections interface and applying reflections to models works exactly the same way. Now, if you have a trial version of our software installed, in SketchUp, click Extensions, and from the drop-down list, select the appropriate product. And again, I want to mention that I'm going to be using iRenderNext as our example today. A fully licensed version of the software doesn't require you to click extensions. The toolbar will load automatically. However, during a trial period, you will find it necessary to load the toolbar for the application that you're trying. So here's the iRenderNext toolbar. You should also be aware that typically the toolbar will install adjacent to the SketchUp tools. However, I have peeled it away so that we can focus on iRenderNext features. In addition to rendering applications, RenderPlus Systems offers a variety of additional plugins, and among them is the NXT Material Library. This is a free extension compatible with all of our rendering software. And once you download and install, what you'll find is that the NXT library is a very nice list of additional materials for your models. And not only do we include materials for each material we've added, we also have some preset finishes that can be selected, making it very easy to control not only the material itself, but also the finish that you'd like to see in your rendered model. I've created a pretty simple model to illustrate the application and management of reflections. This is a SketchUp rendering of the model, and of course, the SketchUp rendering does not include reflections. Now, prior to my first rendering, I removed all of the reflective properties from the objects in the model. And so when I use the rendering software, here is the rendering. It's actually quite a nice rendering. The lighting is very well solved in this model. The model includes both natural lighting. You can see the sun coming in from through the window, and of course the desk lamp, the sconces on the wall, and the recessed canned lights in the ceiling. So a very nice lighting solution. But now, to add more realism to the model, it's time to pay a little bit more attention to the details of this model. And for me, that means adding reflections. This is the finished rendering that I'm after, with reflections added. And I want to point out that I've added reflections to the desk lamp. I've added some reflections to this side chair. Of course, to the tabletop, to the floor. You'll notice that the pictures on the wall now have a glass vase in front of them, so they're reflecting, and of course the column in the corner. And sorry, one more, the vase on the table. So by adding reflections to the model, I'm increasing the amount of detail and making the final rendering look much more realistic. Again, here is the model without reflections. And now let's go through this model, pay attention to detail, and add some reflections to the objects in the model. The desk lamp is a good place to start. With no reflections, the desk lamp is actually reflecting only natural and artificial light, and so we get a very matte finish on the desk lamp. Now there are two very important settings for reflections. The first one is intensity. Intensity measures how bright is the reflection in the surface being rendered. And the second is sharpness, which means how in focus is the reflection in the surface being rendered. You'll notice that with a matte finish, the intensity of the reflection is set to 0 and sharpness is disabled. I wanted to show you this diagram which illustrates intensity values from 0 all the way up to 90. And as you can see, that even at 0, a surface is reflecting natural and artificial light, but not reflecting any of the surrounding environment. At 90%, we have a very distinct reflection of the environment, and also, of course, reflecting natural and artificial light. This diagram is a very nice gauge of the amount of reflection permitted in the surface based on the value set in the intensity portion of the dialog. The 9 defaults shown on this menu have preset values that will result in a rendering that, in this first example, gives the appearance of this lamp being constructed of plastic. When we click plastic and render, the values that are being used are a very low value for intensity and a very low value for sharpness. So there's not much of the environment around this lamp being reflected by the lamp surfaces, and additionally, what is being reflected is very out of focus. Now we change from plastic to metal. Again, clicking metal and then rendering results in this solution for the lamp, using these attributes for intensity and sharpness. Now we have a very high value set for intensity, so the environment around this lamp is being reflected in the lamp surfaces, and with sharpness set to 1, we have reflections that are very in focus, very crisp. You'll also notice that when I select metal, the default is that metallic is checked. And I want to talk a little bit about what this metallic option means. To illustrate, what I'd like to do next is I'd like to check glossy. So now I have a lamp made of metal with glossy selected. Now glossy suppresses the reflections of the environment and gives us only reflections of the artificial and natural light. So these are actually reflections of the light fixtures in the ceiling. And you'll notice that the reflections of this lighting is in the color of the lamp. When I uncheck metallic, and now I'm left with just a glossy finish on this lamp, the reflections of lighting appear in the color of the light source. Now in this case, all of the bulbs in the fixtures overhead are white, and so the highlighting is all white. So again, let's back up. Here is a metallic glossy finish on this lamp, showing reflections of the lighting in the color of the lamp. Remove metallic, but leave the finish as glossy, and we get reflections of the lighting in the color of the bulbs. Now back to metallic. A very high intensity of reflection and highlighting, and a very focused reflection because sharpness is set to a value of 1. Like all presets in iRenderNext or any of our rendering programs, it's possible to adjust these values even after you've selected a preset. So for example, here's the same lamp, slightly different view, but what I did was I rendered this lamp with an intensity set to 0.98, almost 1, which would be mirror-like. And I left sharpness at 1, so I'm getting very crisp, focused reflections in my lamp. So I started with the preset metal, and then I bumped up the intensity of the reflection from 0.9 to 0.98 to make the surfaces on this lamp even more reflective. Same intensity, but a sharpness value of 0.5. So now much less focused. Here are the two rendering side by side. On the left, an intensity of 0.98 and a sharpness of 1. Very focused reflections in the lamp. And on the right, the intensity is the same, 0.98, but the sharpness is set to 0.5. The difference in the finish is that I go from a very highly polished finish on the lamp to a much less polished finish on the lamp, blurring the reflections. So depending on the type of lamp that you intend to render and the type of finish that you're after, most times selecting one of the presets, metal for example, is perfect for the rendering that you want to create. But I want to make it clear that once a preset is selected, you also have the ability to modify the preset values to get exactly the finish on your model that you're after. Not specifically a reflection issue, but a material issue that I want to just mention briefly. The brick wall is, of course, a photographic image of a brick material applied to the wall. And I'd like to use a technique that will make the brick pop just a little bit more. And this is called auto bump. This again is on the material edit dialog. Once I select auto bump and then re-render, I get a much more 3D appearance on the brick wall. This is the chair rendered with a matte finish. So very nice lighting, very nice shading and shadowing. But again, in order to enhance the completed rendering for my model, I want to pay a lot of attention to detail. And certainly if the wood on this chair is a more polished finish, I think we would have a slightly different finish in the rendering. And so what I'd like to do, now in this case I didn't select a preset. What I've done instead is I've gone straight to the Edit Material dialog. If I click to default, I can select a preset, but instead I just set the intensity of the reflection and highlight to 1, and then I've set the sharpness to 0.4. So I don't want a mirror-like reflection in this chair at all. What I really want to emphasize is the lighting in the room against the chair. And when I render, this is the finish that gets applied. Adds very nice detail to this chair and makes it much more realistic. I decided that these printed images are quite nice, but what might help them look a little bit more realistic for my rendering is to put them behind glass. Now this was relatively simple because all that I did was add a glass surface in front of these pictures. Glass, of course, is very reflective automatically, and so add the glass and then render the image. That's all that's necessary, and I get more detail in my model. Now here's an area where we're going to address several issues with this rendering to add considerably more detail to the presentation graphic that I want to prepare. So let's start with the tabletop. This tabletop is currently just shown as a 50% transparent top. But what I want to do is I want to render this tabletop as thick glass. Now keep in mind, when I select thick glass, this is a preset, and so all of the values for thick glass are going to be set automatically. In addition, I'm going to make just a couple of minor changes. For example, I increased refraction. The default is 1.5. I increased it to 2.45. Thick is selected automatically because I chose thick glass. And then I've also checked caustic. Caustic will reduce the amount of light that actually travels through this table. And so it'll make the surfaces underneath the table a little bit darker, meaning on the floor, by the way. So you can see underneath the table it gets a little bit more shadow from the glass that doesn't make it through this tinted glass tabletop. And I have very nice reflections on the table, as well, of course, as being able to see through the table. And I want to point out that I set refraction at 2.45. That's important because that's what glass actually does. If we look at this tabletop before the glass is applied, you see that there's no refraction going on at all. That carpeting, or that area rug, the line is straight through. But as soon as we re-render with this material on the table being defined as glass, watch how the rug edge shifts. A much more realistic rendering of a glass tabletop. Next is the floor, which of course at this point is a nice photoreal texture, but is very flat and so not very realistic. Now, what I decided is that I'd like to have more of a satin finish on this floor. And so I've set the intensity of the reflection to 0.6, and I've set the sharpness to 0.4. Again, I didn't use any of the presets since I have a reasonably good understanding of the result from intensity and sharpness. I felt pretty comfortable just setting these values and then rendering. So now I have nice highlighting on the floor. but not mirror-like, so making the floor look as though it has a nice satin finish, not highly polished. Next, let's look at the vase. The vase is another interesting example of setting values without using a preset. Now, this preset, as it turns out, matches metal, and so you can start by selecting metal, and you'll get exactly these values. Metallic will be checked, the intensity is 0.9, the sharpness is 1. I wanted to make one additional adjustment to this vase by setting the transparency to 10%. Now 10% is not very transparent, but look at the result that it gives me. I can kind of see through this glass vase and see the highlighting from the light creeping in through the window. I happen to really like the solution on rendering this vase, and so making it 10% transparent worked out perfectly for my rendering. And then lastly, what I'd like to do is I'd like some better highlighting on my column. So this is the column. When it starts, it's just a matte finish. And again, what I've done is I've set the intensity to 0.6, set the sharpness to 0.45, and I checked glossy. Now, if you'll remember, a glossy reflection is going to be highlighting from the light sources in the color of the light sources. And so here is the final rendering. Now this rendering is completed in 800 passes. And the reason that I ran so many passes is because the more passes that you run, the more refined the lighting solution. More importantly, however, is that blurred reflections, that is a sharpness value less than 1, also get refined with each successive pass. I want to show you more specifically what that means. So here again is the rendering with no reflections whatsoever, no real detail added to the model other than very nice objects strategically placed. And then here is the final rendering with 800 passes. Very nice lighting, and now wonderful details from all of the reflections that were added to this model. This is the rendering after 50 passes. Now the most notable place is the floor. So you'll notice in this area that we do have a pretty nice solution for this satin finished floor. However, the more passes I run, the more refined this blurry reflection gets. You'll also notice very subtle changes in the lighting because the lighting model also improves with each successive pass. Same model, same view at 100 passes. Considerably more refined. Now after 150 passes, now after 200 passes, and so you can see that the floor is getting more and more of a satin finish. And then finally, here's the floor at 800 passes. Now we've covered quite a bit of information about reflections. The most important things to remember are that typically when you want to add detail to your model, reflection is a good place to start. Most of the time, selecting one of our presets for metal or for glass or plastic is going to be ideal for your model. Keep in mind as well that once a preset is selected, you have the ability to adjust the intensity, to adjust the sharpness of the reflection, to select a metallic and or glossy reflection in order to refine the surface in your finished model. And the most telling feature of this model that illustrates that point is the floor. If I had selected metal and then rendered, I would have a very shiny, glossy floor that would produce almost mirror-like reflections of everything in the model. But what I wanted instead was a satin finish on this really nice floor. And so in order to do that, I lowered both the intensity and the sharpness, and I get a really nice satin finish on this floor. Equally important is selecting metal for the vase and then just changing the transparency of the vase from completely opaque, 0% transparent, to 10% transparent. It's this attention to detail that make the difference between highly successful photorealistic renderings and renderings that are quite good but might be missing a little bit in terms of detail. I hope that you'll join us again for another tutorial on the use of RenderPlus Systems rendering products. I'm Russell Holden with RenderPlus Systems. Thanks very much.